First of all, on behalf of the Black Law Students Association, we thank you again for being here. I certainly want to acknowledge, don't want to move forward without acknowledging. Put your hands together for the president of the Black Law Students Association, Mr. Philip Corentin. We have our vice president, none other than Ms. Brace Gibson. Ms. Gibson, if you would just wave your hand, stand. We have our secretary in the back, that's Ms. Shantanice Ellis. We have our treasurer, Ms. Nicola Deans. We have our Chief Justice, Mr. Michael Smith, Jr. Yours truly, I'm the programming manager for Black Law Students Association, and of course we're joined by many of the Black Law Students Association members, along with some of our committee chairs and directors. So if the Black Law Students Association, would you just stand? If you're in the building, would you just stand, please? This is the group of people who have put this together. We're grateful that you're here. And at this time, we're just going to open up with the invocation for all those who care to join. We ask that the Executive Director of Admissions for the undergraduate, Ms. Sasha Timmy, welcome her.
Thank you. Dear Maker and Creator, for all who we hold true in our hearts, we call upon you today as we gather at this community event. Be with all who have coordinated this opportunity and provided this experience for breaking of bread, sharing this meal, for the opportunity to open our hearts and minds to hear this critical message, a message that provides our community with strength and prompts our action. Bring us peace and understanding throughout this opportunity, and let us not be silent, but give us the strength to push forward. We ask for your guidance, and may goodness flourish. In your name, we lift this request.
Thank you. And if all would stand, we're just going to start this as we have done with many during the Civil Rights Movement and Black History events. If you would all just stand, we're going to start with our National Negro Anthem. Lift every voice, and yes, it will be a cappella. Yes, the words are on the screen. So we have some wonderful vocalists in the house. Miss, so we have Lakeisha, and I'm going to join right in. So all those know it, and it just goes the tempo. I'll go it. Y'all ready? Yeah. Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling seas. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. That one, give me something, round of applause. And at this time, we are so honored and humbled to have our student advisor, none other than the Professor Jeannine Bell. Professor Jeannine Bell is the Richard S. Melvin Professor of Law here at Indiana University. She's done extensive study in hate and police crimes, and here to give us some contextual background for I Have a Dream and some other discussion, I want y'all to put your hands together for one of the most illustrious, one of the most renowned professors here. Put your hands together for Miss Jeannine Bell.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Jones. All right, I want to start this with a couple of words about the context. right, what was 1963 like? And I talked to someone this morning who was in college in 1963, and he suggested that it was kind of a dark time for African Americans. We're going to contextualize this a little bit more after we hear the speech, but I want to remind you what it was like for African Americans in 1963. The time was marked by de facto, right, not by law, segregation that occurs in fact, and also de jure segregation. For instance, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the de jure first, right? It was the law that African Americans could not eat at lunch counters in the South, right? Meaning if you sat down at a lunch counter, then, usually you would be told to leave, and if you continued to sit, you could be arrested. In the South and the North, right, the North had lots of de facto segregation, but this is an example of de jure segregation in the North. In the North, African Americans could not buy housing in white neighborhoods. Not by law, they could not do this. The sort of changes happened after this time, after 1963. Voting, right? African Americans did not have the right to vote. Did not have the right to vote. They voted in some places, but throughout the South, it was the case that individuals did not have the right to vote. All right, and with respect to schools, and here I'm going to end here. This is the de facto segregation. So, for 9 years, African Americans had the right to be housed or to be to go to white schools. 1954, right? So for years and years, it was the case that you could attend white schools, but in fact, individuals in the South and also in the North were subjected to violence when they attempted to go to white schools. So, for instance, 1963, when the events happened that you see in the film take place, 1963 began with George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, standing on a schoolhouse, the schoolhouse steps in one particular school that African Americans attempted to attend, saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. President Kennedy had to send in the National Guard to allow individuals to do what the Supreme Court had already said they could do. This was the setting for the events that you see in the speech. This is what happened. And after the speech, I will say just a couple of words about the relevance of watching this today, given, our lives are different, right? Not as much as you think, but I'll get to that later.
So, and as we are queuing up the film, I want you guys to put your hands together. The Dean of our law school, put your hands together for none other than Miss Dean Austin Parrish. Put your hands together. We'd be remiss without acknowledging. We certainly appreciate you joining us. So, Professor Bell is going to facilitate questions after the film. Just want to think about some of the things as we're watching the film, 1963 to 2019, and the interplay, the lack or the absence of women in the movement on the stage, or the few. Think about some of the laws that have come to fruition since 1963. We'll talk about that after. The person who facilitated and who was orchestrated the entire march, Bayard Rustin, who was a proud, I don't know what word I'm looking for. He was a proud member of the LGBTQ community long before it was legal. It was actually illegal in those days. So take all those things as you're watching this film, the words and why this even came about. So without further ado, I Have a Dream, March on Washington, August 28, 1963.
In order to say that we are determined, and in order to engage in a nonviolent protest to keep this issue before the conscience of the nation,
at this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize the shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. And the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. They were signing a promissory note which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I'm not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities. Knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children be able to sing with new meaning, my country tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the hiking Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
We could just talk. All right. So are we there yet? Are we there yet? All of the things that I talked about, right? The by law, right? The jury segregation, everything, right? So we had the Voting Rights Act soon after. We had the Fair Housing Act in 1968, right? So it was no longer legal to discriminate on the basis of housing. Anybody know how we got the Fair Housing Act?
So right.
Just like randomly, like, vaguely how we got it.
So
Hint. It has to do with the person that we just heard talking. he was shot, right? Assassinated. And then Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, right? We had a fantastic civil rights president, a Southerner who understood that, we needed to do something, and the Fair Housing Act was passed. All right, so my question for you is, 1963 is the year that changed everything. It is defined as the year when people started standing up, right? And there is still massive inequality, right? Massive inequality by race, and in all sorts of other measures as well. And given the desperate situation by law, why aren't we standing up, right? We're not really standing up, not in the way that people stood up as early as 1960. For instance, children as young as 6 years old, first graders, were attacked with water hoses. They were marching. And I'll be honest about this, I didn't bring my 7-year-old here, right? Because, I wanted to be able to talk peacefully, right? And without someone raising their hand and sort of saying things, right? So children as young as 6, people were mobilized. At that march you saw, a quarter of the protesters, or the attendees, right, 250,000 people, a quarter were white, right? Can we think of any multiracial movements right now that are aimed at healing the pain of inequality? I can't think of one. And when I think about attempts to do this, right, all I think about is failures, right? The Women's March, right? Yesterday, a couple of days ago, there was a lot of failure to agree in that context. Not the one 2 years ago. There were some little rumbles 2 years ago. So how are we going to heal the problem of inequality now? If we're not quite at the place that Dr. King suggested we need to be at, right? How are we going to do it, right? We're not mobilized. We are not mobilized, right? If you think we are, tell me about the march that you've seen that, that was sort of large, fantastic, multiracial, and generated all sorts of crazy change, like the Voting Rights Act and all sorts of issues.
I can't do large and lots of change, but I think Moral Mondays is pretty interracial.
Yes, Moral Mondays is Reverend Barber's. It is but it's not huge,
No.
right? And I wonder what Moral Mondays has brought about. Moral Mondays is a fairly, it's a couple years, right? At least a couple years, 3 years. Wonderful, fantastic, not criticizing it, but the types of sort of concrete gains, it's not quite large enough. So what are we going to do? The figures with respect to inequality are staggering. They're terrible, right? We just saw that nice speech, so I'm not going to sort of launch into issues of sort of figures about, so what are we going to do? Mr. Jones, do you know what we're going to do?
If I may, thank you, Professor Bell. If I may, I guess from my viewpoint, I'd like to say, like, even with the March on Washington in 1963, and what we see is the finished product and what's been couched. But what we don't see is a lot of the disagreement that went on behind the scene that you read about. So I think it's important to note, I don't think any movement has ever had a consensus on how to go about it. Matter of fact, there are a lot of different things with SNCC, with Senator John, you know what I'm saying, come on, y'all know. Lewis, thank you. John Lewis, who was the president of SNCC, and Andy Young and all them, that they were made to, because they were able to come out to President Kennedy, and Randolph had to convince them to change their speech at the last minute at that March on Washington, because they were coming after Kennedy, thought he was complicit, and it was a farce. So I think it's important to note that though the speech and that movement, and we had a lot of feet, there was never any consistency, and I think the message is that even without the cohesiveness and the collaboration, it still moved forward. So like even like movements today, like the Black Lives Matter movement, even with the women's movement, the march, and there's some discussion or dissent, if you will, and I think the media plays on that, and I think we get lost in what they disagree about instead of the collaborative nature and the efforts. It was a powerful movement a few months last year when all of these women around the world came together. So I think that's a lot to be said, and not necessarily focusing on the negative aspects of things, because that's with any movement, and that's just my 2 cents. The mics are open, I just want to say that, and for those who participate, let's just say you'll be glad you did. So I'm just leave it at that. There's a mic on this side and a mic on that side.
That is a fantastic reminder of the fact that I attempted to present it as sort of nice and neat. President Kennedy was not in favor of the march occurring, right? Did not want this to happen. There were disparate civil rights organizations that had to be brought along so that the march would even happen. There was, as you noted, early suppression of Van Rustin, who was an important member of the civil rights community, and out, right? Everybody knew, right? And, you know, quite clear about that, and clear suppression in that context. You didn't see him up there, is my sense. There was, his face was not sort of standing right behind King, despite playing a tremendous role. And his biographers say that, the only reason was because he was gay. What?
That was the second time, because the first time they ousted him, and Dr. King, along with all the other civil rights leaders, distanced themselves from him, and they knew that they could not even, this would not have went off without his assistance this time.
Right.
Because Hoover threatened to publish that Dr. King and Van Rustin were in a relationship, and that was colossal in that day. That was...
Right. So, I attempted to present this very sort of neat, sanitized version. I wonder, though, right, whether we'll look back on our contemporary mobilization and say, oh, we look like that, right? They'll show videos of the Women's March 2 years ago, right after President Trump's inauguration, and say, look how great this was. Look at what it did. I really wonder if that, and I wonder if the press, right, the extent to which the press is, perhaps not exploitative, but really showing that we cannot agree, right? We can't get together in the same way. Maybe the reason we can't is that we don't see the situation as bad. you know, the situation is really bad though. That is a sort of, you know, that's a mistake. Seeing it as not bad is absolutely a mistake, because in particular areas we are sliding backwards, right, with respect to African Americans.
So, Professor Bell, thank you for being here and talking today. When I watch this speech nowadays, I think about 10 years ago when I was standing in another large crowd in that same space outside the Lincoln Memorial in a spillover space, looking at a screen, watching Barack Obama be inaugurated as president. And it makes me think about progress and regression, and how in a lot of ways we see things move one direction and then we get backlash, and how the story of these last 50, 60 years is one of one step forward, two steps back every time. And I'm wondering what you think about how we can, you were talking about de facto and de jure segregation, but I think in a lot of ways we have a problem with the balance of de facto and de jure integration now, and progress, and the fact that we too often laud ourselves for de facto progress without codifying it and without making it de jure progress. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think that the next move for us, right, is a move that's pretty different than the move that was made in 1963, right? 1963 was the watershed year, right? It was the year when people saw on television all of the photographs of 6-year-olds being, their bodies being pushed over by water hoses, right? Attacked by dogs, right? Police dogs. That changed public opinion. I think what has to happen now is we need a multiracial movement that is truly a movement of progressives. Now, this is going to be hard because we are as segregated, right, as we've ever been. We are just as segregated as we've ever been. Schools, including schools in this town, are segregated not by law, right, but by neighborhood, right? That is one of the challenges of inequality. We still go to church, right? In separate places. Sunday morning at whatever time church happens, for most people, is still one of the most segregated hours in America, right? So this is going to be a big challenge, in part because the people that were marching before said, all right, we're going to leave the dinner table alone, right? Meaning we're not going to want people to mix, right? To force people to mix in neighborhoods and all sorts of things like that. So that, I think, is the next move. And I think it will be a more effective one. And I believe it can happen. When you look at little kids, right? Little kids, they're happy to interact across racial lines. They really are. It is something that is surprising to me, because little kids have the capacity to recognize people of different racial backgrounds. They get little tiny babies, right? Know that person is not like in their group, right? And their parents are sending them messages, unfortunately, but they also ignore them, you know, which is shocking to me. I mean, later something breaks down, but you know. Maybe we can deal with that later.
Hi, Professor Bell. Thank you for speaking. I think in addition to needing a multiracial movement, we also need a clear leader. And I can't help but think, you know, what would have happened if Martin Luther King Jr.'s life wasn't cut short so soon. And I guess the issue with this day, how we celebrate his life, but we don't acknowledge the fact that he was taken away and what his legacy could have been after that.
Yes, Prophet, right? You know, what's that Marley song, right, about taking away all of the prophets? And I once had a conversation with someone who knew music, and I said, yeah, well, we still got prophets. And he said, oh, we still have prophets? Name one. And I wasn't able to name a prophet, right? So, you know, that the absence of leaders in this way is probably a problem, but we have the ability to create, like, prophets. We can do it, right?
We have David on that side. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Professor, for your words. I actually think we have great leadership nowadays, but the problem is that the issues and the complex nature of race is not in the public's consciousness. Like as you see a 6-year-old getting hosed on TV, you don't see that today because gerrymandering, which is diminishes black political power, it's a very complex issue that doesn't enter a lot of people's consciousness. So can you touch on that?
It's now, it's too complicated, right? Too complicated for people to understand. I don't know. I know lots of people who aren't all that well educated, who understand it perfectly well. I, for instance, recently, and here's a sort of silly example, I went to a hair salon in New Orleans, and this was a fancy, not a fancy place, right? The stars also went there, right? Meaning newscasters and all sorts of things. But it was still the kind of place, in a black neighborhood, they locked the door, right? And you could only gain admission. The types of discussion about taxes and politics and gerrymandering and all sorts of complicated issues like you're discussing happened. I think we need a forum for introducing people to these issues. So, for instance, I had a chat when I went to my 25th college reunion. I talked to a director who was a member of my class, my college class, Darren Aronofsky. He did Black Swan, that's one of the things. And he was talking about writing things for people to understand the damage wrought by meth. So he wrote a series of like PSAs about meth, and I saw some of them, they were shown. And I said, all right, that's what we need for policing, right? To explain to people who don't understand these issues, we need to cut through all of the messages that they've gotten about this. So I think that we have the ability to broadcast this message writ large if we put our minds to it.
I liked what you said about that one of the students acknowledged it about the future is in a multiracial movement, and that's one of the reasons why I do like Moral Monday, which I feel, and I mean I was 12 when King was shot. I can remember learning when he was shot, but I do remember impressions of what the civil rights movement was like there, and I see Moral Mondays as drawing on that to try to be inclusive, to try to include people, to build a multiracial movement, and actually to try to to show working people, black working people and white working people, all the problems that they share in common. And I think that's the way forward. I do worry that we have devolved too much into tribalism along race and gender and cultural lines, both politically and socially.
And I think that the media doesn't help us, right? Does not help us with this issue. So the Women's March, right? The Women's March issue is, I don't think the media was helpful in that particular context of sort of talking about divisions because it's a story, right?
Well, and I suppose the access of, they certainly weren't tweeting about their little differences back there, whereas nowadays people can do that. So we get to hear all the dirt, in real time.
And if I want to touch on that, that's actually kind of where I wanted to go next, and kind of get some thoughts from people in the room about just kind of, now we have a lot of tools at our disposal that people in the 60s did not. And I think that there's kind of this push and pull between the fact that our voices are so loud now that any one of us can tweet at the president and he might respond, whereas back then, what you and I have to say, no one outside the people immediately close to us is hearing those things. But at the same time, we all have such a loud voice, we're drowning one another out at the same time. And so I'm kind of wondering, this is something that I think about often, is like, how do we use social media, and how do we use the things that we have at our disposal now to kind of be a catalyst for change nowadays? Because I think it's really easy to be like an armchair social justice warrior, where you're like, you retweet some things and you're like, that's my good deeds for the week, or I've stopped Joseph Kony or something, So I'm kind of curious to hear what people have to say about that. If anybody else. Oh, I think Zoe was next. And
They were
bring it back
actually
to you.
on the other side.
Okay.
Just kind of going off what Philip said and something that someone said earlier. I think it was David. I think one thing that is kind of stopping us from having the mobilization that we saw back in '63 is a lack of clarity as to what exactly the problem is. It's kind of hard to attack a problem that you can't pinpoint. And I think that the switch from de jure segregation, legal discrimination, to the situation that we have now is difficult to respond to because, like David pointed out, you're not seeing 6-year-olds being hosed down by water anymore. It's the situation or the problem that we have now is different. So I think defining the specific things that we want to change first would be helpful in I guess, mobilizing people to want to change.
In some areas, I agree, and in some areas, we have brought changes. So, for instance, stop and frisk, right? Stop and frisk was an area in which large numbers of kids, right, little, teenagers, right, ended up going to jail in New York City. New York City is a sort of jurisdiction, massive numbers. And the civil rights community organized around stop and frisk, right? There were a series of lawsuits, there was lots of speaking up, and they don't do that in the same, I'm sorry, you had someone elected, right, who actually had a kid who might be stopped, right? Had 2 kids, somebody who might be stopped. And that was the end of stop and frisk. Now, it wasn't just the mayor, right? Because a judge, Judge Shendlin, had ruled against the police department, and but they were going to appeal it. The police department, they were going to appeal it for like forever, right? And the mayor's like, no, we're stopping this, right? So, you know, that's a discrete area in which there was mobilization around something that mattered, right? And affected the lives of, you know, thousands and thousands of New Yorkers. At its height, there were more than 600,000 stops of individuals in a single year, right? So this is, you know, in a city, in one city, in New York. It's huge.
Well, this was going to be a comment that went back to Kevin's and your point at the beginning about the Women's March, and kind of ties into Zoe's point about not knowing what the problem is. But I don't want to take away from Phil's question either, because I think that's an important thing to discuss next, just the way that this was staggered. But yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I think when we think about the way that the media frames it, like, I think we see this over and over again, where we see a potentially good movement or potentially progressive move on the part of either the government or even just like grassroots movements. But the problem is, because we're human, we're imperfect, or we have, you know, we aren't addressing our implicit biases or whatever, you know, we leave people out. And even when we were thinking about like the civil rights movement and the homophobia that was there in that time, like, there are people who are not necessarily being invited into that movement. And the problem is that when either somebody is recognizing that or those people are speaking up, the media then frames it as, you know, the dissent, the disagreement, we're not getting along, instead of like using that as an opportunity to be productive and actually figure out how to be inclusive in the progressive movement so that it's not just good. But it doesn't mean like the whole movement is all bad, and it doesn't mean that it only did good things. It's just like that ability to blend the weaknesses with the strengths of it and have productive conversations instead of letting the media like derail it into just dissent and disagreement.
And I think part of the reason, I agree entirely, I think part of the reason that so many of the difficulties arise in multiracial sort of cross-group organizing is that we don't know each other, right? We didn't go to school together, by and large, right? We don't live in the same neighborhood. We don't have friend groups that are multiracial. So it's easier to see that individual as other. And one good test for this is the military, right? The military is a space where there's been substantial integration. Not that the military doesn't have problems, but there are things that people in the military understand that people in other types of work spaces do not, because of the sort of interracial nature of the space.
Yeah. Before Lakeisha goes, I just want to make a comment real quick. I think one of the issues is we're viewing the civil rights movement and current topics. During the civil rights movement, it was no black people, period. I don't care how affluent or poor you were, we had the same issues. Unfortunately, today, many of us don't understand or feel the same effects of segregation, because we are able to be at Maurer School of Law. We can sit here without being rocks thrown at us. We don't need the National Guard to bring us up here. Some of us live in affluent areas. So I think the difference now is because of dynamics. Everybody's not feeling the same power. We're not being lynched. We're not being brutally. So we kind of discount, oh, they were criminals, that's why they were shot down. And so I think that's a little different. So as opposed to the civil rights movement and now, and not having the same. But I think there are a lot of leaders, but if it don't affect me, and Dr. King said, what affects one directly affects us all indirectly. I just don't think we realize it. Lakeisha Barnes.
Mine was basically about to be exactly what you said. I feel like in certain spaces, there's an unwillingness to listen to what the other person is trying to say when they're explaining certain issues that they're feeling. For instance, my sister's best friend comes from an affluent area. She's white, and my sister was trying to explain to her why a lot of the NFL players during the time when they were taking a knee, and her best friend was not really willing to listen to the fact that it wasn't necessarily that they were disrespecting the flag, but it was because of essentially police brutality, and she couldn't seem to understand that, and she wasn't willing to listen to her. So I think it's also an unwillingness in some spaces for them to want to hear what we have to say or what other groups have to say, and I think that also plays into a role with what Zoe was saying and what David was saying. It's like it's an unwillingness in some spaces to listen, whereas in academic spaces we're more willing to listen to what each other has to say because we're trying to learn from one another.
Yeah, I wonder what would happen, right, in these conversations if they'd known each other and been close friends since they were 4 or 3. So here's an example that I have from my daughter's childhood. My daughter is one of 3 African American girls in her grade at the largest elementary school in town. And what do I mean in her grade? I'm not talking about her class. There are 5-ish second grades. I mean in the entire second grade. There is one, so I attended an event, and there was one girl that was holding hands with my daughter, she was in the center, and another black girl. And she was white, right? That little girl is going to be, and my daughter has known her since she was 3. That little girl is going to be different when she is in law school, right? She will have always known someone black who talks about issues, right? Talks about issues. Now, this kid also I don't want to dismiss the importance of parenting here. This kid also has progressive parents, right? Progressive Southern parents. And the South got a very bad rap in the speech that you saw. And how many of you are Southerners, for instance? Like real Southerners, like Deep South Southerners? Where are you from?
Southern Mississippi, like seminary, like an hour north of Jackson.
Okay, all right, yes. So my parents are from Brookhaven, right? So, similar area. Where are you from?
Tennessee.
Tennessee, yes. So, okay, all right.
My grandparents from Mississippi and Arkansas.
Okay, yes. Now, in the South, brown people and white people eat the same things. They go to the same restaurants. They hang out in important ways, right? So I think of the South as an area where there can be change. And look at Atlanta, Georgia, that's South. What is the race of the mayor of Atlanta? She's black. Atlanta elected a black female mayor. I don't expect that to happen in Bloomington, Indiana, liberal Bloomington, anytime soon, right? So, major southern city, right? So, knowing each other, I think matters.
So, I think we've just had a whole long list of fantastic suggestions about what would make a difference to organizing now. People really knowing each other across social boundaries, differences of all kinds, focusing on specific issues, learning to use social media and the various sorts of internet tools we have well, leadership, and so on. And I just wanted to add one more, because watching this film, you know, I don't know about the rest of you, but I always cry at the end. And that's because it's not just about what's wrong. It's also about what's right. You know, I have a dream, I have a vision, I have something positive, a beautiful goal that we can all work towards. I think we need that too. We can't just be saying what's wrong. We also have to be saying what it is we want, a vision that people across these differences can join together to try to achieve. I think that would help too.
All right, so I agree with everything everybody's said, which that it's very sort of abstract plane. It seems to me, you know, we're all, most of us at any rate, are part of a law school community. We're either lawyers or going to be lawyers. There are things we can do that we're equipped to do, specific things that we can get together and do, that do not solve the entire problem, but solve parts of it at a time, and they're discrete and they're doable. And, you know, one thing that comes to mind, we can try to start a movement of legal scholars, which includes students, to basically shame Chief Justice Roberts into admitting he made a mistake, that he was simply wrong on the need for Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. He might not do it, but it would get some attention, right? And this is something I think lots of law schools across the country would buy into, and it's very concrete.
That is precisely the type of thing that might matter. I mean, one of the other things, and I've so appreciated your saying this, Dan, one of the other things that we need to keep in mind is it's easier if you find the space in which you're going to mix things up, mix it up, right? I went to a march for police brutality with my little kid, right? And I realized, she was about 3, I realized that this is not the space for me, right? When the anarchists showed up with the face masks and they wanted to block traffic, I thought, not this space. This is not what I'm gonna do. But I will go to the middle of Kansas, right? And talk about, to high school students about multiracial coalitions, right? 500 high school students, yeah, I'll do that. That's more, you know, within my skill set than standing out there with the anarchist, right? And that's not to say it's easy. Oh no. That trip to Wichita, Kansas during the hardest semester was not easy. But I did it, right? Because that's within my wheelhouse of things to do.
So we have like about 15 minutes, and we got a very special announcement. But if you want to get in, I want you to join. And as we continue to go on, let's just give another round of applause for Professor Jeannine Bell doing an amazing job and lead us in this discussion. We have a student.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Bell. I think one thing that's important, and it's kind of hard, not hard, but it should be easier, I guess, as white students and people that want to get involved from our perspective, is we just need to be more willing to participate in these conversations. Like one part of the solution, I think, is just having a dialogue and being willing to engage in that and not feeling uncomfortable. Or sometimes it's hard because it's like, what do we really have to offer? How much perspective do we really have on these problems? But I mean, I still think that, you know, as Dr. King said, we have to walk hand in hand, whites and blacks, and that's how we're gonna work towards a solution. So really just being willing to engage and participate is a big part of it. And kind of normalize these conversations in more of a public forum.
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely. And it's like a muscle, though. You have to exercise it, right? It doesn't hurt so much lifting it when you've lifted it a few times, right? And also, you'll see that people aren't scary, right? Meaning they're not thinking bad things when you say something. So just exercise the muscle. I encourage all of you to exercise the muscle.
Right here.
Early on, you mentioned that one of the most segregated hours of America being church, and it got me thinking about a while ago. I started thinking, looking at ways for interfaith organizations, and I never followed through on it. Never found one. Get lazy. But I thought, what are the thoughts on interfaith churches and maybe getting together once a month, like as a joint congregation with other faiths?
Yeah, they do have interfaith churches and multiracial churches, even here in Bloomington. This is the exception, though, rather than the rule.
I feel like it can be done more.
Right. Yes. Absolutely. Especially given doctrine is doctrine, right?
Me. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what happened, at least my 1L year, with the white supremacist organization that put posters on your door, and talk a little bit about the action that you took and how, because I just found it really interesting what you decided to do in response.
Yeah, so I'm a hate crime scholar who came to Bloomington, Indiana in the wake of the most violent hate crime that Bloomington had ever seen. I rocked out. I was told by a friend, you need to look at the New York Times, and right there above the fold was a hate crime that had occurred in the town that I was set to move to in 3 weeks, right? So it was troubling, and the town was protected, right, to the extent that any horrible tragedy can protect an individual, because the town had responded, right? There was an organization that got together and responded to the anti-Semitic and racist flyers that were being left on people's doorsteps. They founded an organization, and they were aware of this. The university itself responded, right? The university said, listen, you better not put any of those flyers on university property. If you do, you will be in trouble, right? This was a student, we controlled that space, and we don't want to see anything like that on that particular space. So when Benjamin Smith shot a graduate student, the university and the town had done something. They hadn't acted like, oh, this is nothing. So one of the things that institutions can do is they can respond. So when I walked in that day, right, minutes before I was teaching a big class, I saw this poster on my door right next to a picture drawn by my first grader, something like that, right? Kindergartner. I knew immediately, I didn't know exactly what it was. I knew it was not good, right? And there was another faculty member, right, who saw these posters all over the law school and figured out what they were and ripped them down, right? So attempted to protect the community from seeing this, garbage, right? So I took a photo of it, removed it, and I was called by members of administration. How you doing? The dean called me, right? Called me and said, how you doing? What do you want to happen about this? I ended up speaking with the police officer who was in charge of the investigation of this postering, and she did what you can do. The lieutenant did what you can do in a state without hate crime legislation. We are all privileged to live in one of the 5 states in this country without any hate crime legislation. She said to the perpetrator, who they identified, in a lot of cases you can identify hate crime perpetrators because they brag, right? Right? They're proud of this, right? This was on their Facebook page. Everybody else was watching the Super Bowl, they said, and this is what we were doing. And then pictures of lots of spaces, right? So they found the person. So this lieutenant told me that she said to this guy, listen, if we catch you on campus doing stuff like this again, we're going to arrest you. And that's a way that the police can deal with perpetrators even in the wake of situations where there isn't legislation. So, did I answer your question about this? So what happened with that? That's what happened with that.
Do we have any more questions, comments, contributions?
I just wanted to briefly thank you guys for coming out. And also, one thing I just kind of want to, someone alluded to it earlier, all of these things that we've kind of brought up and kind of deliberated about, I think that it's very important for us not to be afraid to speak up when we see something wrong. You know, no matter who you are or like where you come from, if you see someone being mistreated, let's not be afraid to speak up for one another. Let's not be afraid to stand up for one another when you see something wrong, even if that's not a direct threat to you. I think that that's something that I would like to see a lot more of in my own life, and that I am, you know, trying to be better about. And I think that you know, will have a huge ripple effect if we can all, you know, if we see one thing going on that's wrong and we say something against it. I mean, I think that if each person can do that one time, you know, the effects are huge there. So
Thank you. That's our president of the Black Law Students Association. Put your hands together. At this time, we also keep those applause going. Keep those applause going. We certainly want to give a big, hearty thank you. We're so honored and humbled. Professor Jeannine Bell, of course, she is a named faculty position, the Richard S. Melvin Professor of Law, law professor. So put your hands together for her insight, specializing in hate crime and police crime. So I encourage you to just stop by our office. A lot of information, a wealth of knowledge. I'm in her class, so we're excited. So again, put your hands again together. She deserves another round of applause. And of course, we're so honored to have her as our advisor, our faculty advisor for the Black Law Students Association. And if Mr. Ben Adams and David, if you would stand, the two of you stand. What you didn't know, we had a professor, the first two people that contributed to this discussion received 2 tickets to the Barrister's Ball. So you both have Barrister Ball tickets. On behalf of Professor Hughes, yes. So congratulations for participating, which leads us into what the whole message, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "I have a dream," and I think that's the most important. One of his quotes was, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in the moment of comfort and convenience. The ultimate measure of a man is where he stands in the moment of controversy and conflict." That determines. And in the end, he said, "It will not be the words of my enemies, but it will be the silence of my friends." So it's real important to stand up, be the change that you want to see. Be that change, as various ones have alluded to, and just think about that. Let's wake up from the dream and let's make it reality. And I think that's what's really important, and that's where we start right here from the legal community as a whole. And we thank everyone for their participation and just understanding we don't have to agree, but all we have to do is just respect and come together and just make it happen. Because there will be, I think they said, a lot of brilliant minds will differ on the same thing, but as long as our goal is the same, and I think that's important, that there's more than one way to skin a cat. That's what my grandma always say. So let's just hold a tail and help each other and take turns in skinning this cat, because one day Dr. King said we will be free one day. I would be remiss, I want to allow opportunity. We have I see our librarian is here. We have Dean Parrish has declined, but I just want to offer extended again. Dean Parrish, if you would just have a couple of words to just greet the audience, perhaps, please. If you put your hands together for Dean Austin Parrish.
Thanks. Well, thanks. Kevin just told me that I was speaking, so this is going to be a little inarticulate. But maybe we could have another round of applause for BLSA for organizing this event. I was just struck by the quality of the conversation. I don't know if any of you were able to attend some of the other MLK events that were occurring around campus. Tamika Caskins gave a great talk this morning at the IMU, and she focused a little differently on Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy about service and making a goal each day for yourself, and how that led her to, she has a tremendous life story about her achievements. And it sort of reminded me, picked up on things that both Kevin and Phil were saying right at the end there about the importance of our community. And I don't really have great answers to how you solve police brutality or mass incarcerations or gerrymandering. I think these are difficult topics. But I do think it's true that we each graduate here with a law degree and an ability to do more and make a difference in our own communities. And that can be really big about rethinking how we achieve social justice on a large scale. But it can also be really important on those small day-to-day things about helping people that are less fortunate than us. And I really think that sort of commitment to public service and commitment to making a difference in our communities is one of the messages that Martin Luther King Jr. Day really means to us. And so I hope you take that to heart, not just for this, but sort of more broadly about thinking how you build your community. And that can be attending things like Barrister's Ball, which is one of our great events to bring together the community. But I think it's also remembering after you graduate how, whatever way you want to do it, whether it's taking on the really big challenges or really taking on the small challenges, how you can make a difference with your law degree in a way that's meaningful to yourself. So thanks for coming today, and thank you, BLSA and Kevin and Professor Bell for inviting me, including me. I thought it was a great conversation. I hope we continue to have more of these over the coming years. So thanks, and thanks for the opportunity, Kevin.
Dean Austin Parrish. And we also want to thank Mike, who's videotaping. We appreciate it on his day off. Thank you. Let's give a round of applause for him videotaping this event to memorialize it. And before we close out, I'd like for the executive board of Black Law Students Association, as I call your name, to come down, because I think it's important. So we talk about leadership. Leadership starts on some of the most fundamental levels like this, even here at the school and different. We don't have to be the Dr. Martin Luther King on a national level. Leadership is just in our community, and leaders aren't always in front. A lot of people have led from behind, like the women who made all those sandwiches for that march, and all the different things, the bus drivers who organized that, the people, the housewives who help along the way, as Dr. King talked about in his speech. So there are many ways to be involved, and we don't minimize anything, every contribution, and that's what it all collectively come. Right now, our president, Mr. Philip Corenting, we're going to come to so get back. Just come down so we can take our picture. At the same time, we'll just be down here. So I just want to introduce you to the leadership of the Black Law Students Association. And before we close out, we just want to allow Professor Jeannine Bell one last time to close us out and have comments if she would. So please, our Vice President, Ms. Bryce Gibson. If you just make your way down here. We know our treasurer had to leave, Ms. Nicola Dean. She had to leave other obligations, but our secretary, Ms. Shantanese Ellis, who's also the chair for the Barristers Ball, coming up on February 16th. So if you've gotten your ticket, please make sure you get your ticket because they're going to be selling fast. We've made it easier. Of course, our Chief Justice, Mr. Mikey L. Smith Jr. Put your hands together. I'm yours truly, our 1L representative, Ms. Lakeisha Barnes. Please come down, join us. All of our executive directors, our directors over our committees, if you would join us, we have Julian, Zoe. I'm sorry, yeah, I just got off of 5. I've been to bed at 5:30. Just came in the country, so my name's so I don't want to mispronounce anybody's name. We have Rachel, please, Alexis. Yeah. Am I missing anybody? Any of our other? These are our committee chairs. Who are doing a great job. Our community outreach, what is that do right? Community service. Yes, our director, our newsletter, she's doing an amazing job. Our marketing, and this is our alumni, director of alumni relations. Did I miss anybody? And for the rest of the boss up, who makes this body work, come join us. We have our past Chief Justice, Savienne Brutus. We have Sydney Baines, I'm sorry, my brain freeze. LaShyla, come. LaShyla, come. And all of our members, don't make me call names. I started calling names, and that's a bad thing, and I know I messed up. So come down. We're going to take our picture. We're going to take our picture as we go. And we, as Ashley, last year's Barristers Ball chair. Ashley, I'm sorry. See, I told you, I'm 1 or 2 hours of sleep. And Dean Parrish, if you would join us before you leave to take our picture. But we're going to allow Professor Jeannine Bell. Put your hands together once again for Professor Jeannine Bell.
Thanks so much for your questions. That's it.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. And we want to acknowledge the president of FALSA in the house. We have Ms. Dana Moon. Thank you so much for being here, Dana, and everyone else, and all our wonderful students. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Get more food, take home lunch. One of our SBA representatives, 2F representatives, Mr. Benjamin Adams. Dean, well, thank you. That's it. That's all, folks.